In the previous presentation, you were introduced to the approach that we will be taking in this course. We talked about applying principles to cases, and we identified 5 moral principles we'll be using. Let me talk now about 2 underlying convictions that we will accept, you might say, without necessarily arguing for them in any sort of convincing way, but 2 underlying convictions that we'll be operating with throughout this course. The first is that these principles apply to everyone, and to everyone equally. Moral judgments are what Immanuel Kant called universalizable. They apply to everyone, everywhere. Secondly, we will understand these principles to be prima facie rather than absolute. That is to say, they point to important moral considerations. But every one of these principles we will find when we think about them in real-world contexts can be overridden, and in other words, violated in a situation where some other more significant moral consideration points us in a different direction. Let's look at both of these matters in greater detail. So I will insist that these principles apply to all human beings and apply equally to all human beings. I've already referenced Immanuel Kant's claim that moral norms and judgments are universalizable. If you are making a judgment, he would insist that you're not willing to apply to everyone in any time or place in a similar situation, then it's probably not a valid judgment. Probably a less sophisticated way of saying the same thing. You often hear people say in criticizing a decision or a judgment that someone makes or an action that someone engages in, what if everyone did that? Right, and that is pointing towards this idea of Kant's that moral judgments should be universalizable. Now, I want to be clear. When I say that these principles apply to all people and to all people equally, I mean 2 things. I mean that all human beings are obligated by them, and at the same time, all human beings are protected by them. So look, we will talk about a principle of non-maleficence that suggests that it's wrong to harm other people, to hit people over the head with a baseball bat for the fun of it. The idea that these principles apply to all people and to all people equally means that if you were to say, well, you may be obligated to hit somebody, not to hit people over the head with a baseball bat, but I'm not. When I feel like doing it, I may, because I'm big and I'm powerful, and therefore the rule doesn't apply to me. No, if the principle of non-maleficence is truly a valid moral principle, it applies to everyone. It applies to the most significant and powerful among us, and the least. None of us may simply hit people over the head with a baseball bat for the fun of it. We are all obligated by that principle. But at the same time, we're all protected by it. That is to say, if someone were to say, well, we may not hit most people over the head with a baseball bat, but people of this particular category, maybe this particular race or gender or that particular political orientation, or who plays for the team that we don't like, it's okay to hit them over the head. No, that would be wrong. If the principle of non-maleficence is valid, everyone is protected by that principle. So, as this slide suggests, since all people are obligated by these principles, if someone were to say, well, you may have an obligation not to hurt people, but I don't, they are wrong. One may not, in making moral judgments, make an exception for oneself or for the groups with which one identifies. Similarly, all people are protected by these. So if you were to say, well, I agree that I have an obligation to help my fellow Americans, to be concerned about their welfare, but I have no such obligation towards the people of Nigeria, that person would be wrong. Universalizability means no one may be excluded from our moral attention. And if you think about some of the isms we've dealt with, in our history, what they have involved is limiting the who is protected by our moral principles. So racism is the idea that people of a particular race are excluded from moral concern, or that different treatment is justified in relation to people of a particular race. Or the same thing with regard to sexism, that somehow a woman may be treated differently than a man. A woman does not have the same protections that a man has. We call that sexism, and it's a violation of our moral beliefs. Now, I do want to make one caveat here. What I'm saying about the equal protection that our moral principles entail for all human beings is no way to exclude the possibility that you or I might have responsibilities to and for particular people, our own children, our own spouses, our own family, that we don't have to others. Healthcare professionals have obligations to their own patients that they don't have to other people. In saying that these moral principles apply equally to all human beings and that all are equally protected by them, I'm not excluding the possibility of particular obligations to particular people. So pay attention to the distinction we'll draw from time to time between general, universal obligations and special obligations. We will be referencing those issues in relation to the fifth moral principle, the principle of fidelity.